Jin-Woo scratched his temple, finding her response pretty ridiculous. Was this monster being cocky, or just way too hopeful? The demon noble snuck a glance at Jin-Woo's face. She realized things weren't going in her favor, and quickly looked down again, her voice filled with desperation. Spare my life, and I'll give you anything you want. Jin-Woo crossed his arms, clearly unimpressed. Even though this demon noble was a powerful monster, killing her now would be easier than catching fish in a bucket. What should I do? He thought for a moment. It wasn't about whether to let the monster go. It was about what could be more valuable than the experience points or items he'd get from killing her. Then it hit him. An entry permit. The demon's head jerked up in surprise. The monster looked almost like a human girl, except when she opened her mouth, then you could see her long sharp canine teeth. Jin-Woo asked casually, "Hey, can you grab me one of those?" The monster turned pale and stared at him in shock before quickly putting her forehead back on the ground. Guess monsters don't know much about items. Oh well, no big deal. Jin-Woo pulled out Barca's dagger from his inventory. He was shocked that there was a monster smart enough to beg for mercy, but he wasn't going to let it go. After all, a demon knight had given him 3,000 experience points, so this one must be worth even more, right? If he killed this thing, he might finally get that entry permit he needed. As Jin-Woo was about to make up his mind, something shifted. "I'll give it to you," he said hesitantly. "Give me what?" the monster asked sharply. Jin-Woo's voice trembled as he replied, "The permit." The monster's eyes snapped toward him, and her face went pale with fear when she saw the dagger in his hand. "You can really get me an entry permit?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Jin-Woo nodded quickly. "Our family protects it," he explained. "If you help me get back to them safely, I'll give it to you." The monster's eyes widened in surprise. "Demons guard the permits," she muttered, clearly shocked by this revelation. Jin-Woo tapped his chin thoughtfully. He had been stuck on the 80th floor for ages, defeating a bunch of demons, but there was no sign of that permit anywhere. At first he figured maybe the drop rate for items got worse on higher floors, or perhaps a mini-boss would hand one over, but then it all made sense if the monsters were guarding the permits like this guy said. The demons started to get nervous because Jin-Woo wasn't saying anything. It began to act all fidgety and desperate. "I know where all the permits for the higher floors are. If you promise my family and me will be safe, I can show you," someone said. Jin-Woo thought hard about this offer. It was super tempting. His biggest goal was to reach the top floor as fast as possible, and knowing where all the permits were would really help him do that. The only issue was, could Jin-Woo trust this demon? His hand shot out and gripped her chin. He could feel her panic spiking, but he didn't let up. He stared straight into the demon's eyes, his gaze cold and unyielding. A murderous intent. Jin-Woo's power flared to life. A chilling energy radiated from him, like a frost spreading through the air. The demon's lips quivered as fear shook her entire body. "Can I trust you?" Jin-Woo demanded. "I am telling the truth," she stammered. Jin-Woo had made a promise to himself. When he first gained his powers, he wouldn't let anyone deceive him. Not again. Jin-Woo believed in fairness. He'd give as much as he got, even if his opponent was a monster. If she kept her word, so would he. "All right," Jin-Woo said, turning off his murderous intent. "Hand over those permits, and I'll leave without a fight." "Oh really?" the other person stuttered in surprise. Jin-Woo nodded. It was a shame he wouldn't get to fight those monsters. Guarding the permits, they would have given him some good experience points, but wandering around, searching for them was just a bigger waste of time. Jin-Woo had already wasted more time on the 80th floor than he'd planned. But honestly, if everything turned out to be a lie, that was okay too. He'd get to teach her and her kind a lesson. "Thank you." The demon noble looked like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Jin-Woo raised an eyebrow, unsure if she truly meant it, or if she was just being naive. He had one thing he'd been dying to ask her. "Hey, before we go, can you tell me what are you, exactly?" Jin-Woo asked. "I'm Essel, eldest daughter of the Radier clan. My family is," she started to explain. "Hold on, I don't need to know about your family right now." Jin-Woo interrupted. He was way more curious about why monsters existed, and how these secret worlds worked. He didn't need a long explanation. Just give him the short version. He was hoping for any hint at all. He had asked the same thing about magic beasts. But the only thing he'd learned was that they kept hearing whispers in their minds telling them to attack people. So did monsters hear a voice too? Jin-Woo decided to ask something simpler so he could compare them to magic beasts. Do you also hear a voice in your head telling you to kill humans? He asked. Sales looked up at him, confused, and tilted her head. Huh? She said, blinking. Since Sale was still on her knees, Jin-Woo had to look down to meet her eyes, which felt super awkward. He let out a small grunt of frustration, reached out, and pulled her to her feet like she was a little kid. Jin-Woo locked eyes with Essel again. Her heartbeat pounded like a drum, betraying her nervousness. Does something whisper in your ear, telling you to hurt humans? He pressed on. Essel hesitated, glancing down before speaking softly. No, but we do hear another voice. What does it say? Jin-Woo's curiosity piqued. The words spilled out cautiously. It tells us to protect our home. Her eyes flickered, searching for his reaction. Monsters, unlike magic beasts, had a different purpose. While magic beasts sought to destroy humans, monsters stood as guardians of their dungeons. Their reasons for being were totally different. Jin-Woo wondered, does that mean I'm like a magical creature to monsters? He felt a bit bad for scaring Essel with that intense voice, but not too guilty. When did you start hearing that voice? He asked. Ever since we woke up here, Essel replied. Jin-Woo's eyes widened in confusion. You mean you guys weren't always here? Whether this was a real memory or something planted in her mind, there it was. This could be a clue to help crack the mystery of the system. Jin-Woo kept pushing for answers. Then where were you before you ended up here? He asked. Berslashes. In the demon world. Basal replied. One day we just woke up here. Berslashes. What were you doing in this demon world? Jin-Woo pressed on. Berslashes. We were getting ready for a war. Berslashes. A war. Jin-Woo's eyes widened in surprise. Berslashes. Yes. Berslashes. 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 Basal. Actually remembering the past. Her expression turned serious, different from when she was pleading for her life before. We were on the edge of war against an enemy so strong it felt unstoppable. She began. She paused abruptly but then continued without finishing that thought. Jin-Woo noticed her lips kept moving as she spoke, trying to explain how they had gathered demons from all over to unite against this threat. But no sound came from her lips. Instead, Jin-Woo heard the system's electronic voice. The message repeated over and over. The conversation includes confidential information and has been blocked. It kept going until Elsel finished her answer. Jin-Woo's eyes lit up with excitement. Shed, he thought to himself. If the system had stayed silent, I wouldn't have even noticed. He would have just assumed Elsel was explaining some made-up backstory about things like leveling up, entering dungeons, completing quests, earning rewards, facing penalties, and changing jobs. It all sounded a lot like stuff you'd find in a video game. A backstory for monsters wouldn't have been weird. But what just happened made Jin-Woo realize one thing: talking to this monster could uncover more secrets. The system had slipped up, revealing something it probably didn't mean to. Oh, was it something I said? Azizel's voice trembled as he eyed Jin-Woo's serious face. He looked worried, like he'd said the wrong thing. But Jin-Woo wasn't even paying attention to Essel. His mind was racing. What was the system hiding? Who were the demons fighting? Why did they go to war? What happened in the end? Jin-Woo pressed for answers, his curiosity growing stronger. Then he asked the most important question of all. Who was this super powerful enemy that scared everyone so much? Suddenly, Essel froze like a toy whose batteries had run out. But only for a moment. Oof, she sighed faintly before collapsing. Jin-Woo quickly caught her and gently laid her on the ground. She was still breathing, though she looked uncomfortable. Jin-Woo quickly tore off Azil's armor to help her breathe easier. The armor cracked and came off in pieces easily. He then ripped off the cape attached to it, rolled it up, and placed it under her head like a soft pillow. It was a hassle doing this, no matter if it was for a monster or not, but he wasn't exactly doing it out of the goodness of his heart. This enemy of the demons. The system kept their identity a big secret. Maybe there's something special about them. If they had some kind of powerful ability that could affect the earth, or even him, Jin-Woo decided to call up the shop. He tried to wake Issel with a potion, but nothing happened. I guess I have to wait then. He sighed. Suddenly there was a loud thump. He sat down beside her, his mind racing as he pieced together all the clues he had found. Issel jolted awake, her eyes wide with confusion. "Ah," she muttered, looking around frantically. She could tell someone was right next to her. Issel froze when she saw Jin-Woo sitting there quietly. This wasn't a dream, she blinked hard, snapping back to reality. Her eyes darted around and what she saw made her breath catch. Dead archdemons were scattered all over the place. Her eyes widened in shock. Dumb demons didn't think of smart ones like her as part of their kind. If those mindless monsters had found her while she was out cold, she'd have been an easy target. Issel's eyes snapped open. She was alive. "Did you protect me?" she asked softly. Jin-Woo didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and held out his hand. Issel took it, and he gently pulled her to her feet. She smiled, touched by his quiet kindness. "Thank you," she said. "How much farther till we get the permit?" Jin-Woo asked. "It's not far," Issel replied. "I'll show you the way." She held out her wrists, pressing them together like handcuffs. Jin-Woo tilted his head in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked. Issel frowned too, just as puzzled as him. Annoyed, she broke the silence first. "If I'm a captive, shouldn't you tie me up?" He shook his head. Not necessary. He was sure he could handle her without tying her hands. No point wasting time on something that didn't matter. Jin-Woo turned her around and gave her a gentle push forward. As they moved, he noticed her heartbeat speed up. She was still scared of him, but he didn't say anything about it. Jin-Woo stared at the horses left behind by the monsters. "What about these horses?" he asked. "I'll take them," Issel replied, her face turning red as she grabbed the reins of 3 horses and started walking. Jin-Woo followed quietly behind her, just like Issel had said. They soon arrived at a strange spot that looked like it might be hiding something important. It was a massive medieval-style fortress, a demon's castle within the demon's castle. The demon's castle dungeon was more like a tower than a castle. But what Jin-Woo saw before him looked straight out of medieval times. Guards at the castle gates tensed up as soon as they spotted Jin-Woo. "But then, a guest," Issel said casually, flicking her chin toward them. Instantly the guards relaxed and swung the gates open. As Lady Issel stepped forward, a group of knights in gleaming armor emerged from the castle gates. Their helmets caught the sunlight, shining like polished steel. "Lady Issel, we've been waiting," one knight said, his voice firm yet respectful. Lady Essel's gaze was steady, her expression serious. "Where is my father?" she asked, her tone urgent with concern. "He's in the throne room," the lead knight replied, nodding gravely. Just then, another knight noticed Jin-Woo standing a bit behind her. His curiosity piqued. He tilted his head slightly. "Lady Issel, who is this man?" he asked, eyeing Jin-Woo with mild suspicion. Lady Essel's response was calm and clear. "He is an important guest. Show him respect." The knights bowed their heads in unison, then stepped aside to make a path. Lady Issel led Jin-Woo through the grand halls of the castle, their footsteps echoing softly off the stone walls as they made their way toward the throne room. I adjusted some details to enhance engagement and clarity for younger readers, while keeping the core elements intact. They had been walking down a long hallway for what felt like forever when they finally stepped into a massive room. It was like entering the lair of a final boss in some epic video game. Jin-Woo looked around, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Is this the throne room?" he asked. The chamber was pretty bare except for towering columns that stretched up to the ceiling, like giants holding up the sky. The echoing space felt designed for one thing: battle. If they had fought their way here, this would definitely be where the boss fight went down. And there, at the far end of the room on a raised throne, sat what had to be the big boss of this castle. A demon noble, waiting patiently. Seal, and Jin-Woo stood face to face with him. The boss was the first to speak. Seal," I said sharply. "Father, this is..." Seal started to explain. But before he could finish, the boss's eyes locked onto Jin-Woo. His eyes widened in shock. "You, who in the world did you bring here?" he barked. "Father, he's a guest." Seal tried to calm him down, but the boss wasn't having it. "A guest? What kind of guest brings an army into someone else's house?" The boss's voice was rising. Seal looked at Jin-Woo in confusion. "What army?" he whispered, still staring at Jin-Woo with suspicion. The boss muttered, his voice trembling. "I know what I saw." "Ezeal, Can't you see those soldiers hiding in the shadows around him? Jin-Woo squinted. His tone sharp. Isiel flinched and stepped back, clearly caught off guard by the sudden change in Jin-Woo's attitude. Jin-Woo had a way of sensing things others missed. The boss seemed to have noticed something unusual about Jin-Woo specifically. The shadow soldiers Jin-Woo could summon at will. Jin-Woo wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not, but just in case things turned messy, he quietly recalled all his shadowy fighters. Do you really think it's smart to bring an army into my home? The boss barked, his voice echoing sharply through the room. At the sound of his anger, knights stormed in, ready for action. Father, Isiel shouted, sounding worried. The boss stood up, glaring at Jin-Woo like he was the biggest threat in the world. Jin-Woo stayed calm, watching everything unfold without saying a word, until now. Jin-Woo stood there, looking super cool and calm. The boss was clearly surprised by how unfazed he seemed. What did you promise? The boss asked. Jin-Woo took a step forward and said, I'll leave peacefully if you hand over the entry permit. The boss gulped hard. Is this guy for real? He thought. He had heard rumors about Jin-Woo tearing through demons like they were nothing. The boss had been really bummed when his top guys, Vulcan and Metis, got killed. But honestly, they weren't that tough. They were from the Red Ear clan, which was super weak compared to others like 20th in strength overall. If that enemy had taken down Vulcan and Metis without breaking a sweat, the boss was bracing for some serious damage. But then this scary enemy offered to just leave. The castle lord wasn't so sure. Is that all you want? He asked cautiously. Jin-Woo, who'd been waiting for this moment, grinned. Well, there's one more thing. Of course not. The boss scowled as his suspicions were proven right. A powerful being's demands kept piling up endlessly. How much more embarrassment would this man bring to the Red Ear clan? And how far would he push the knights with these unreasonable requests? The demon's leader was already annoyed even before Jin-Woo had a chance to speak. Jin-Woo placed his hand on Essel's shoulder. I'd like to take her, he said casually. What? Both the boss and the knights erupted in protest at the same time. Jin-Woo glanced around at the demons, confused. Earlier, Essel had mentioned she knew where all the entry permits for the higher floors were. Jin-Woo wanted her to come with him as a guide. Did I say something wrong? Asked him, he wondered. He looked around at the boss, who was trembling like a leaf, the shocked knights and Essel's blushing face. Jin-Woo blinked in confusion. A guide. The boss finally composed himself after hearing Essel explain and listening to Jin-Woo's request. He sat back down on his throne. The permit. And a guide. Is this really all he wants? For as long as they'd been here, protecting this place had become second nature, like breathing or blinking. But now his stomach twisted into knots at the news. Black armored soldiers had stormed in, chasing down demons like they were prey. He thought it was all over. Then the boss sent out some troops and wow, they beat those black soldiers easily. But then scouts found even tougher enemies, led by a fire-breathing beast. A giant knight, and another fierce knight with a mane on his helmet. The scouts weren't sure if their side could handle these new threats. That was why the entire Red Ear clan had been gearing up for battle. But there was zero mention of this guy standing in front of them now, in any report they'd received. In other words, their real strength wasn't actually here. It was somewhere else entirely. If I'd known this super powerful guy controlled those shadow soldiers, I wouldn't have even thought about fighting back. The boss could see how things really were. Those shadowy warriors were still there, lurking deep inside him, ready to strike whenever he gave the word. It sent shivers down his spine every time they shot him. Those angry looks. Pride aside, I have no choice but to make this deal with a human. And yes, that pass to get in. It was definitely something we had to keep safe. Was protecting the scroll really worth such a huge cost? The boss doubted they could win against the black soldiers, even if they lost their entire army. Then there was Jin-Woo, this mysterious human, who seemed super strong, but was clearly hiding his true power. The boss had no idea what Jin-Woo's plan was, but he could tell Jin-Woo was calm on the surface while hiding something big beneath. It was super scary to stand up against a foe you didn't fully understand. The boss looked worried and asked, is that honestly all you're asking for? If giving up the permit would protect everything else, then agreeing seemed like the logical choice. This plan doesn't break any rules because it actually helps protect the area from more damage. Jin-Woo nodded. You promise you won't hurt my daughter, right? Jin-Woo could tell Epsiel was staring at him. A monster who cares about his kid. That idea was kind of amazing. He shook his head, and the boss thought for a moment before breaking into a big smile. Got it. Jin-Woo said with a grin. The boss looked like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. If this piece of paper could really stop the disaster they'd been worried about, then there was definitely reason to celebrate. Jin-Woo had been bracing himself for the worst, but the boss's cheerful smile made him relax and chuckle along. I guess Ezel got her spunk from her dad. Hey, he thought to himself. Was all this just part of some programming? Or did it actually mean something real? For now, Jin-Woo pushed that question aside, and gave the boss a clear, confident answer. I'll keep my promise. Good. The boss snapped his fingers, and a soldier brought Jin-Woo a large scroll. He opened it. It was an actual entry permit. Jin-Woo smiled as he read through the details. Item. Entry permit acquisition difficulty. This permit grants access to the 81st floor of the demon's castle. It can only be used on the magic teleportation circle, on the 80th floor. Jin-Woo hadn't thought he could negotiate with monsters to get an item, but here it was, the real deal. The only thing that set this permit apart from the ones he'd gotten on lower floors was the red stamp of Radier. Jin-Woo wondered if this meant he would need to collect permits from different clans as he went higher. He smiled, relieved. This system was much better than running around, hoping a monster might drop what he needed by chance. Jin-Woo rolled it up and tucked it into his inventory. Should we get going then? He asked, turning to hurry Esil along. But when they tried to leave, knights blocked their way. Jin-Woo shot Esil a suspicious look, but Esil just grinned at him. What was going on? The boss stepped forward, his massive monstrous body towering over Jin-Woo. Yet, despite his intimidating appearance, the man's face wore a warm, friendly smile, like a middle-aged guy, inviting you over for dinner. The Radier clan can't just let a guest leave without a little something, the boss said, trying to sound persuasive. Why don't you join us for a meal to celebrate? My daughter needs to get ready for her long trip anyway, Jin-Woo said. Glancing at Ezel, she seemed hopeful he'd say yes. After all, she'd kept her word, so it felt right to return the favor. Plus, he was getting tired of eating just bread and meat from the shop every day. Okay, sure, Jin-Woo agreed finally. The boss laughed, clearly happy with the decision. Good. Ezel's face lit up, and so did the knights. Soon, the boss started yelling at his workers. What are you waiting for? Go and get ready for dinner. Jin-Woo had already spent way too much time on the 80th floor. He wanted to move through the other floors as quickly as possible. Luckily, one thing he was worried about, whether Ezel could use the teleportation circle, was solved before he even had time to think about it. A demon noble would like to join your party. Do you want to accept? If you accept, your companion may use the teleportation circle, and experience points can be shared based on her contribution. Share experience points with my team. The words hairs bothered Jin-Woo a bit. But then he noticed something important. The part about contribution. Jin-Woo figured out that if he didn't let Ezel fight, he wouldn't have to split the experience points. He worked this out with her. If we run into a fight, just stay back. Jin-Woo said, I'll handle it. Ezel looked down shyly and mumbled. Got it. Jin-Woo nodded, accepting her as his companion. Then they quickly set off on their adventure together. Asil was lugging a giant backpack that was almost as big as she was. Even though her pack wasn't heavy, she struggled to keep up with Jin-Woo. He moved so fast it was like he had wings. Sometimes he'd stop and wait for her to catch up. Look, there it is, Asil exclaimed, pointing at a castle in the distance. She had been studying a map of the 81st floor, and now the castle was finally coming into view.